Hello, everybody. It's good to see you again on this Thursday. Before we get started, I want to share with you about Rhonda's situation and myself. Rhonda does have COVID. She's doing really well, though. She tested positive Monday morning, and she basically just had a cold. That's about as far as it's gone. It's not really been too severe for her, but she is. We are in quarantine right now, or she is. I'm not sick at all. But I've still got to behave according to the quarantine guidelines, so I'm not doing a whole lot either. But I'm not sick. My brother's staying with us. He's not sick. So the only one sick is Rhonda, and she's just having mild symptoms. There should be no reason for us not to be able to be there on Sunday for sure. I'll be there for sure, and I'm sure that she will be there also. But keep us in your prayers so she gets over this as quickly as possible. She's had some coughing and some congestion, so it kind of makes it hard for her to sleep sometimes. All right, so that's enough about us. So this week I want to talk about wisdom literature from the book How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. This chapter on wisdom is actually chapter 12. I'll talk about chapter 12 today. Now, wisdom literature is, I chose to do this week because it's probably the easiest to work through, and it's probably an area where most people aren't really interested in. Maybe you like Proverbs. Maybe you like some of the information in there. Well, this would be very interesting for you, and I think it'd be very, very helpful for you. But there are other writings in the Old Testament that are also part of this classification of wisdom literature. So you have the book of Job. I'll talk about each of these in a second. Job, you have Ecclesiastes, you have the Song of Songs, and then you have Proverbs. Now, some people will lump a few Psalms into this wisdom collection. I don't think that's probably appropriate. We'll talk about the Psalms as a collected writing coming up in a few weeks, but I don't think Psalms are part of the wisdom literature. Now, in the New Testament, we don't have any wisdom literature at all. Sometimes people will argue that the book of James is a type of wisdom literature. I disagree. I do realize that James is very choppy in the way that it presents information. It doesn't seem to cohere very well. It's not. It just seems to be a lot of different information presented and it peppered at you in a way. It doesn't really seem to be linked together in a cohesive fashion. However, James does not present the same kind of or doesn't communicate in that way as far as like wisdom literature does in the Old Testament. So wisdom literature in the Old Testament basically presents general truths. I don't see James presenting general truths. In fact, I think James is best understood as an exposition of parts of the Sermon on the Mount. So we don't have any wisdom literature styles in the New Testament itself, but we have these in the Old Testament. Now, why they get lumped into this is interesting. I think most these writings are Job, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and Proverbs. These writings get lumped into there because there is, at some point in there, advice is given. Some kind of advice is given to someone else for the most part. Song of Songs isn't that way, but it gets lumped in there, but I'll talk about that here in just a second. So what we have some kind of advice given from an experienced person or somebody has a different perspective, but they're giving some kind of advice to someone else. That's generally what's going on within these style of writings. Now, it is this label of wisdom literature is kind of a catch-all for some things. Some of these writings, they don't know what to do with it. Like the Song of Songs. I mean, it is not really wisdom literature. It's a love story told in a poetic rendering, but it gets lumped in there. It's like we have nothing else to do with it, and so we're just going to lump it in there. Job doesn't really seem to be wisdom literature. Yeah, I know there's advice being given, but it's bad advice. So it doesn't really fit what I would consider wise information or wise telling of information or some kind of information that leads to some kind of wise response. Or activity. It doesn't do that. So now Ecclesiastes probably fits better than the other two for sure. And I'll talk about Ecclesiastes here in just a second. But let's talk about Job first. And then we'll talk about the other two, and then I'll talk about Proverbs, and we'll close this up. Job. um, is a very odd story. It almost seems that the story is trying to, well, it's talking about an unexplained loss, or losses. You guys know the story of Job. Job loses lots of things. He loses his health. He loses his livelihood. He loses his family. And he's grappling. He's struggling, trying to figure out why he has experienced all these losses. And so that is the thrust of what's going on there. Now, Job is strange in that the writing is strange in that Job, the character, wants an answer from God, but God does not give him an answer. In fact, the very end of Job is kind of strange because basically God says, you don't need to know, and I'm not going to tell you. Basically what happens. So Job never does find out why he had to experience these losses. Now, the story tells us why. We have this interaction between Satan and God going on, but Job doesn't know what's going on. So there is no explanation for the losses. Job just has to deal with it. Now, within the story itself, we have this, in fact, a large section of Job is basically this interaction with Job and his friends. So his friends will dialogue with Job. They'll converse, and they'll try to explain to Job why he's going through this. And Job will counter and say, no, that can't be so because of this and this and this. So basically they tell him that he's done something to anger God or violated some of God's directives or something to that effect. And that's why that's why Job is going through these difficulties. Now, Job itself, we have no mention of the Old Covenant. We don't know where this story is going on at. We have no idea who even Job is. The Hebrew is very archaic. The practices seem to reflect very early practices of religious ritual, in that patriarchs were the priests and you didn't have an office of a priest. So it seems to be set in a really, really old time. But the advice that Job is receiving from his friends is bad advice. And Job never gets an answer to his dilemma, his question. He never does find out why he experienced these losses. Ecclesiastes. One thing for sure about Ecclesiastes is that Solomon did not write it. So you can just scratch that off the list. Solomon did not write Ecclesiastes. It seems to be coming from an aged mentor. It could be a king. In fact, a king could be telling a younger prince or something that how to reign and what's going to be most effective. But it seems to be like an aged mentor talking to a younger person about life. And the aged mentor has experienced many different things and thought that they could find some happiness in these things, and it turned out that they did not find what they were looking for. And ultimately, the person comes to the conclusion that true happiness in this world only comes from following God and following His directives, being loyal. So that's where it ends up. Now, Ecclesiastes, you know Ecclesiastes just from that refrain where it talks about there's a time to do this and a time to do that, and it goes back and forth, and there's several different elements in there, like there's a time to plant and a time to harvest, there's a time to be born and there's a time to die, there's a time for this and a time for that. And you probably hear a lot of this at funerals. That was never its intentional purpose, let's put it that way. They didn't write it for funerals. It seems to be some kind of a some advice that's trying to be passed on to someone else. Now, Ecclesiastes itself, right now, Old Testament scholars in the study of Ecclesiastes are torn about how to approach the book itself. Some see it being a representation of cynical wisdom that would be associated with Greek philosophy. And it very well could be, because it seems to fit real well into that kind of mode of cynicism. Meaning like a person's telling all the negative experiences and basically comes out with this, view that everything is worthless or vain, and this is what life is. Another view is that this is actually a positive retelling of how to live life, and ends on a very positive note. So my point being is that Ecclesiastes is very tough to understand what's going on within it, and what is the purpose of the writing, and people puzzle over it. But for sure, we have someone who's giving advice to someone else. That's for sure. Song of Songs is a poetic love story. Again, I don't know why it's lumped into wisdom literature. But it's Solomon. Seems to be Solomon retelling a story about a love flame that he has or had or something to that effect. The Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes, neither one of those are ever quoted in the New Testament. Job is quoted twice. Proverbs are quoted about 3 or 4 times. But Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs, they are never quoted in the New Testament. Never. The Song of Songs, to tell you the truth, I really don't know why we have it in the Old Testament. But I think a lot of it has to do with the Jewish people, the ancient Jewish people, seeing themselves within the story, seeing it being a metaphoric retelling of their relationship with God. And I do know that the Song of Songs is read at one of the festivals every year. So it becomes important in that sense. It has a ritualistic purpose for them also. Okay, let's talk about Proverbs real quick, because that's the main thing we want to deal with when we deal with wisdom literature. In fact, when you think about wisdom literature, wisdom writings, you probably automatically think of Proverbs. So, Proverbs, the way it was put together, these are collected writings. We don't know where they came from. Some of them came from Solomon. It says some of them are sayings from Solomon. Some come from other places. So they just seem to be a collection of things that are just brought together and compiled and edited in a way, and then this is what we have. It's very hard to find any kind of a structure in Proverbs. There are people who claim that there is a structure. And if anything, there is thematic cohesion in parts. But again, what we have is just a lot of disparate sayings that are just been kind of brought together and compiled and formatted into what we have today. So they are attempting to try to provide some cohesion, but it wasn't like someone sat down and just wrote this from the beginning to the end. That's not the way Proverbs came about. It just didn't happen that way. Chapters 1 through 9 in Proverbs are different than the rest of Proverbs. In chapter 31 mirrors what goes on in chapters 1 through 9. So basically in chapters 1 through 9 and then in chapter 31, I'm going to set it aside and come back to it, you have these more lengthy presentations of wisdom or foolishness. In fact, in chapters 1 through 9 of Proverbs, you have the appreciation of wisdom is offered. So there's they extol wisdom. In fact, Proverbs 8 has this wonderful story about well, it's almost like the eternal nature of wisdom. I think we have to be careful the way we deal with Proverbs 8. Some people do think that some of the ideas in Proverbs 8 may have some influence on the Gospel of John chapter 1 with the Logos. I don't really think that's what John is actually doing, but some people do try to make that claim. But we also have within chapters 1 through 9, you have a father giving advice to a son about how to live in a certain way, to have peace and happiness in life, so forth and so on, to be wise. Chapter 31, you have the story of an industrious woman. In fact, I'm sure many of you heard sermons from Proverbs 31. And so what's interesting about Proverbs 31 is this. In the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew sequencing of the books, I don't know why we don't follow the Hebrew sequencing. We follow actually the Greek version of the Old Testament sequencing. I don't know why. It's just illogical. I'd say it's probably because of the Christian riff with Jewish people a long, long time ago. But regardless, in the Hebrew Bible, Ruth, the story of Ruth, follows Proverbs. So what does that mean? You have the story of the industrious woman that closes out Proverbs, and then you have the story of Ruth right afterwards. And so it almost as if Ruth is an example of the industrious woman. So in the Hebrew Bible, the sequencing makes a lot more sense than what it does in ours, as far as the way Ruth flows from this Proverbs text in Proverbs 31. in the midst of Proverbs, from chapter 10 to chapter 30, mostly you have these short, pithy statements. One verse. I mean, this would be the one time I could say that you could go with just one verse, because that's really all it is. And so each one seems to be different. Again, there may be some cohesion based on the thematic idea, but it's not always readily apparent. It just seems to be a collection of things just kind of thrown together. But they're really, really short, pithy statements. Now, let me give you some advice about how to read through Proverbs, because that's mainly what we're dealing with when we deal with wisdom literature. So just 5 things I want you to consider about how you're supposed to understand the information that comes out of a wisdom literature writing like Proverbs. First thing is this. Wisdom literature or Proverbs presents general truths. So these are not absolute concretes. So what it's saying is when this advice is given, so it gives advice, if you do this, then this is likely going to happen. Likely. A general truth. It's not an absolute truth, meaning that if you do this, it's not absolutely certain it's going to happen, but it's likely to happen. That's the way it communicates, this style of writing communicates. It's different than exhortative writing. This is not the same style of writing. And so they give these general truths. So we have to be cautious about the way that we use this information, because that proverb doesn't fit in every circumstance. It's not always going to come out that way as you want it to, or whatever you're trying to use it for. It's not necessarily an absolute concrete outcome. These are just generalized truths, likelihoods that will occur if you follow this advice. Second thing is this. Wisdom is not common sense in the Bible. In fact, it's never that way anyway. That's just kind of a folksy understanding of wisdom. So this is not an idea about intelligence or IQ points or getting smarter or anything like that at all. Wisdom in the Bible is simply this. It is, first you have to know the Torah or the Old Covenant. You have to know, so you have to learn. There is some learning, but it's all about learning the Old Covenant. You have to know the Old Covenant, and you have to live by the Old Covenant. That is wisdom in the Bible. So it's not about IQ or intelligence or anything like that. It's about living according to God's guidelines. That's what wisdom is about. Proverbs often describes benefits that would come out of your loyalty to God. You follow the Old Covenant, here are the benefits that you should expect. But again, it's not necessarily an absolute, but likely that these things will happen. There is not any rhyming scheme or a catchiness to the way that a saying is written in Hebrew. They don't have a rhyming scheme in Hebrew. They don't have this kind of communicative style in their writing. They just don't do that. Now they can have like syllables that they can have a certain amount of syllables to a line to where you have the same amount of time spent, I guess, on a certain line or a stanza, and it could have a flow to it that way. But they don't have any kind of a rhyming scheme or anything like that. So if there is a rhyming scheme in your English translations, it's only because a translator has interpreted it that way and translated it in that way. It doesn't necessarily mean it's absolutely correct. There is not a rhyming scheme in Hebrew at all. These are just short, pithy statements giving advice and the benefits associated with this. Many of these statements, these witty, pithy statements, are grounded in some kind of cultural information or cultural practice. So the more you know about culture, the more you know about history, the better you're going to be able to understand some of these proverbs. So real quick, let me just sum this up. First thing is this. The writings of the Proverbs, the proverbial writings, do not give us absolute truths. They only give us general truths. What I mean by that is generally this is what will transpire if you follow this practice. Generally, but not always. And that's the way they communicate. Second thing is, wisdom is not about having more knowledge. It's about living according to God's guidelines. And so it's different than the way that we think about wisdom. So again, we've got to think like an ancient Jewish person. And then Proverbs tries to encourage obedience to the Old Covenant by stating the benefits that will happen. If you obey, then here's the things that you can expect to happen in most instances, that kind of idea. And then again, any kind of cultural information or historical information is always going to be very, very helpful for you as you're studying through this, through wisdom style writings. So, or any writing in the Bible. More history you know, the more culture you know, the better you're going to be at understanding. For next week, what I want to do is I want to go back. So in How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, I want to look at chapter 5 next week, and we'll start kind of going through this according to the layout that it has in the book. But we're going to look at Old Testament narratives next week. I'm just going to talk about narrative style writing, what you can expect in narrative style of writing. So we'll be dealing with that next Thursday. So you can go ahead and read up on chapter 5, and we'll be dealing with that next week. Please keep Rhonda in your prayers. She seems to be doing better, but we want her to get over this as quickly as possible. So I hope you all have a great week, and I will see you on Sunday.